The Canadian government has announced additional humanitarian aid in response to the Syrian refugee crisis, which includes the creation of a Syrian Emergency Relief Fund. CBC News National Affairs editor Chris Hall joins us now live in Ottawa with more. So, Chris, we saw Christian Paradis, the Minister of International Development, making that announcement just in the last hour. What are the details?
Well, you're right. It's a Syrian Emergency Relief Fund, Andrew, and what the government says it will do is it'll match donations that Canadians make to recognized charities working in the region, up to a total of $100 million. This fund will start today, as early as today, and will run through to the end of the year. And clearly it's a response to the plight facing tens of thousands, if not millions now, of Syrians who are caught in the conflict in their home country, both between ISIS fighters who are approaching, but also the civil war that's been ongoing for some time. So today, Paradis announced the first step of what we expect will be a more broader response, comprehensive response to the Syrian refugee crisis by the government. And here's what he said about where the money is going. Have a look.
These funds will be used to help meet the basic needs of conflict-affected people in the region, including shelter, food, health and water, as well as protection and emergency education. The fund will also be used to provide assistance in some transit countries for refugees when these countries are eligible for official development assistance.
So as you hear there, Andrew, this is the money that's going into the region. It's very broadly based here. And this is something the Canadian government has done before with the response earlier this year, for example, to the Nepal earthquake and also in Haiti, where they will match the donations given by Canadians in order to try to provide direct assistance in the affected region.
All right, Chris, I want to get to what Jean Chrétien had in a second, but I want to ask you another question, because we heard from Premier Kathleen Wynne, who applauds this kind of money, the $100 million, but she and other critics have said, we want the federal government to expedite refugees coming to this country now. So what are we hearing on that front?
Well, Jason Kenney, in an interview with me on the House today, says that announcement will be coming soon. He's ruled out a couple of things, Andrew. There's no military airlift, for example. And he said specifically that the government is interested in targeting what he called the most vulnerable refugees from the Syrian conflict based on their religious and ethnic backgrounds, the persecution that they face. And what's interesting, unlike the money that's being directed today by Christian Paradis, Kenney says the government is looking to try to sponsor and resettle refugees who are not necessarily in UN-sponsored refugee camps. So we're looking for an announcement early in the week to say just how quickly the government feels it can start to expedite the removal or resettlement of refugees. But clearly today, Ontario is saying it has some money and it would like to see refugees coming by the end of the year and through 2016 to try to get them into Ontario. We've not yet heard the Canadian government's response to this.
All right, and we're expecting to hear from the Liberals and the NDP. In the meantime, Jean Chrétien has spoken out about all of this. Tell us about that, Chris.
Yeah, an extraordinary open letter to a number of newspapers in the country where Jean Chrétien takes issue with how Stephen Harper in particular has responded to this crisis. And let me read one of the paragraphs that he wrote. He says, "It is today with great sadness and shame that I am watching Mr. Harper's cold-hearted reaction to the tragedy of refugees from Syria and Iraq. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has stepped up to the plate, but not Mr. Harper. He has shamed Canada in the eyes of Canadians and of the international community." Now, obviously, Andrew, Jean Chrétien is a Liberal, Stephen Harper is a Conservative. It's not necessarily unusual for a former Prime Minister to take issue with a policy of a government that's followed. But what stands out for me is the very personal nature of this, that Mr. Harper, he says, has shamed Canadians. You don't usually hear that kind of direct personal attack. And one other small point, Stephen Harper and Jean Chrétien have spoken since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. He has consulted Jean Chrétien in the past. I don't know what the reaction of the Conservatives will be, but I'm sure this is not something that they had expected, and something I'm sure came out of out of the blue for Stephen Harper.
Well, we did hear a little bit from Christian Paradis, Chris, and he said something along the lines of, we have divergent opinions sometimes, but that Chrétien recently met with Putin, so it seemed kind of a way for.
So, yeah, tit for tat, clearly, on this particular case.
Seemed they were maligning Chrétien a little bit. I think that was the gist of it. But Chris, thank you very much. That was
Andrew, thanks.
CBC News National Affairs editor Chris Hall in Ottawa.